Hi everyone, and welcome back to Biology 206. My name is Dr. Jennifer Baltzer, and today we're going to be talking about predation. This lecture covers everything in chapter 12, with the exception of the Lotka-Volterra population dynamics model section. So everything else you should take a look at and read, and we're using lots of examples from that. As a reminder, because we have a guest lecturer this Thursday, Dr. Francis Stewart, the second lecture of this week on competition will be pushed to next week. So we'll only have this one week 7 lecture. We'll only have this one week 7 lecture. Okay, so first of all, what is predation? Well, it's probably a little bit broader than you might imagine, okay? Predation, the definition from your textbook, is a trophic interaction in which an individual of one species, a predator, consumes individuals or parts of individuals of another species, its prey. And so this may seem like a pretty simple definition, but a lot of times when we think about predators, we're thinking about carnivores, right? Animals that eat other animals. But in fact, predators can be kind of any number of biotic interactions where one individual eats another individual. And this can involve parasitism, it can involve herbivory, it can involve carnivory. And we're going to be talking about all of these, we're going to be talking in this lecture about these two forms of predation, herbivory and carnivory. Okay, right, so the three main types of predation, which we just talked about, are carnivory, both predator, which is the carnivore, and prey are animals. Herbivory, the predator, an herbivore, is an animal, and the prey is a plant or alga. So we have, in this case, we have both predator and prey are animals. So they're both heterotrophs. In herbivory, we have predator. The predator is an herbivore, so a heterotroph, and the prey is a plant or alga, so an autotroph. And then parasitism is the predator, a parasite, lives in symbiosis, close physical and or physiological contact with its prey, and consumes certain tissues without necessarily killing their host. Okay, and in both of these definitions, so herbivory also typically does not involve the death of the prey species. So the only case in the three of these where you consistently have the death of a prey species in response to this type of predation is carnivory, okay? And so this is pretty straightforward. Animal-animal, where one animal consumes another. Animal-plant, where an animal consumes a plant. And a parasite living in symbiosis with a prey. And that can be kind of any combination of types of organisms. It doesn't need to be there's many ways that parasitism can happen, and it's a huge topic in and of itself that we won't be covering this in this course. And so that's pretty straightforward, but not really, because of course nature has come up with all kinds of creative ways to make that more complicated. And two examples, one that we saw on the first slide is the case of carnivorous plants. And we see these carnivorous plants have evolved repeatedly in different plant lineages, very commonly in environments where nutrients in soil are very limiting. So things like ombrotrophic bogs, heathlands, these types of systems where there's a lot of limitation in the soil nutrients, and as a consequence, they need to get their nutrients somewhere else. And so there are all kinds of amazing adaptations. This example is a Drosera or a sundew, in which this carnivorous structures have these sticky droplets, and when an insect lands on those sticky surfaces, it gets stuck, and then the sundew is able to digest it and absorb those nutrients. And there's all kinds of different ways that carnivorous plants, all sorts of amazing structures that carnivorous plants have developed. One great example is the northern pitcher plant, Cerencia purpurea. Cerencia purpurea, which is found in bogs throughout Canada, throughout northern Canada. And its leaves curl up into a pitcher that fills with water and some digestive juices, and different animals fall in and are digested and consumed by the plant. But when you apply fertilizer to the soil around those plants, that pitcher unfurls, and the plant and the leaf becomes photosynthetic, or the plant simply won't produce those pitchers. So you can see the sort of response to nutrient availability in some of these species is really neat to observe. So just one example of, you know, a situation where carnivore is not an animal and an animal. In this case, it's a plant consuming an animal, which is a little bit bizarro world. Okay, and a second sort of strange example is the case of parasitoid insects. In this case, we have a parasitoid wasp, and what that wasp does is it lays its eggs, it oviposits inside of these aphids. And then the young of the larvae from that parasitoid wasp develop inside the aphid, and slowly over their course of development, they consume that aphid, eventually killing it, and then the adult emerges from the shell of the aphid. So when we think about these parasitoids, and there's again lots of examples of where this, you know, in lots of different lineages where this has evolved repeatedly on the planet, is this a strange case of parasitism? Or is it a strange case of predation? You know, in this case, the larvae consume just a single prey over the course of their development, but they consume that individual and kill it. In contrast, you know, you could think about it as a strange form of parasitism, where eventually, in every single case, the host is killed by the parasite. So it kind of falls in that gray zone, much like these carnivorous plants. So unusual types of adaptations that kind of blur the lines between these different groupings and make those definitions, you know, these are the typical definitions, but sometimes there's exceptions. Okay, and this is just a reminder of what we're thinking about here. Okay, so we've already talked about autotrophs in a previous lecture. These are, you know, organisms that create carbon via photosynthesis, right? Okay, so they use light, the energy from light, to fix carbon, to generate the energy to drive the Calvin cycle and fix carbon dioxide into sugars. And that forms the biomass of these plants. Okay, so this is photosynthesis. These are autotrophs. They're at the base of any food web. And then as you move up, you have this second layer of herbivores. And if you recall from our previous slide, herbivores predate autotrophs. And another category that falls under this is detritivores. So when we think about things like worms that consume decaying plant material, they're still consuming material produced by autotrophs. And so those detritivores are also considered, you know, they're at the second tier in the food web and are considered herbivores. Okay, so we have our first layer of our food web, autotrophs, our second layer, which is our herbivores and our detritivores. And then we have our third and fourth layers, and for the purpose of today's lecture, they're going to be lumped into this layer of carnivores, and those carnivores, of course, consume the herbivores and the detritivores. Okay, so this is kind of the hierarchy of these different types of organisms that we're looking at. Okay, so just to contrast these two groups, so we have this little table here comparing carnivores and herbivores, and there are some differences. You know, carnivores, they kill their prey. Herbivores, typically they do not kill their prey. It's very unusual to have a herbivory event that actually kills the individual that is being predated. So very often we have herbivores that consume some portion of the foliage or some portion of the roots, but it's very unusual to have herbivores that actually kill the organism that they're predating. So with carnivores, prey can move around, hide, all of these different behavioral modifications to respond to the carnivores. So the way that carnivores have to seek out their food resources is quite different from that of herbivores, where their prey is stationary. Plants can't move around very much. Carnivores, the prey is more nutritious and has a higher nitrogen concentration compared to the prey of herbivores. And we can see this depicted in this figure. So on the x-axis, we have nitrogen content, which is denoted as a percent of the dry weight of the organism. And we have different categories. So we go from xylem sap, so the sap that's moving up the xylem in the tree from the roots through the xylem up to the leaves. The phloem sap, so the phloem is on the outside of it's the part of the plant that carries nutrients and sugar around the plant. Gymnosperm leaves, so gymnosperms being conifers for the most part. Angiosperm leaves, so flowering plants. Seeds and animals, okay? And all of these different categories have a different range in terms of the nitrogen content. The lowest being xylem sap, and that's not terribly surprising. The xylem carries predominantly water and some nutrients from the soil up into the plant. Next being the phloem, and of course that reallocates sugars and nitrogen from within, around the plant, within the plant. And so the concentrations of nitrogen in phloem sap are higher than xylem sap typically. Gymnosperm leaves are higher in concentration of nitrogen, but lower than deciduous leaves, which tend to be in around 3%. That's a pretty typical foliar nitrogen concentration for angiosperm leaves. Seeds overlap a lot with angiosperm leaves and nitrogen concentrations. And then if you take a look at animals, so we have here a little insect and a little mouse, they're way up around 10 to 20% nitrogen content. So nutritionally, compared to any plant part you could eat, animals contain more nutrients than do those plant parts. So herbivores have a less nutritious food source that has a lower nitrogen concentration, so they tend to have to eat more regularly and take in a higher sort of bulk of food. Carnivores typically also have broader diets than do herbivores. So herbivores tend to be fairly specialized, both in terms of the plant species that they consume, as well as even the part of the plant that they consume. So carnivores may have a preferred food, preferred prey species, but a lot of times they'll take what's available and they eat the entire organism typically, with the exception of a few bits and parts. Okay, so thinking about dietary breadth. So again, some species have preferences for their prey, but most eat what is available. And so this is exemplified in this idea of prey switching. So as a particular prey becomes more abundant, the search image up by the carnivore's search image for that prey species improves, and the carnivore becomes more efficient at capturing that prey. So as that prey species becomes more abundant, more frequently encountered by the carnivore, the search image of that carnivore improves. It's able to capture that prey species more readily. And we see this depicted here with these guppies. And so percentage of prey that are worms, percentage of worms in the diet. And so we see a positive relationship between the percentage of prey that are worms and the percentage of worms in the diet. When worms are really infrequent in the prey population, they're also infrequently consumed by these guppies. When worms are really common, they're also very commonly consumed, and in fact, somewhat more frequently consumed. So the blue line represents how much they're consumed. The red line represents their relationship between those two things. And so we have percentage of prey on that are worms on the x-axis, percentage of worms in the diet on the x-axis. So this exemplifies that idea of prey switching. Those fish are able to, when worms are more common in the prey population, they're able to better hone in on those and are more efficient at capturing them. There are also some species that have, much clearer preferences for their prey, and Snowshoe hare, this example of snowshoe hare and lynx that we've seen already is a great example of that, where we have, when you have these predator-prey cycles, it's a really good indication that there's a fairly strong specialization or a strong preference by that carnivore for a particular prey species. In this case, hares. And so we see we see hares in the red line peaking and crashing, and lynx, which are the blue line, peaking and crashing in just an offset way from the hares, indicating that as the hare population crashes, that lynx population also is no longer supported because they aren't switching to some alternate prey source. And they do to some extent, but this suggests that there's a much stronger preference by this species for hares than for other small mammals. Okay, and then we can talk about the dietary bread than herbivores. So there are certainly some large herbivores that will prey on a lot of different species and will consume kind of any part of the plant. So you can imagine an elephant wandering along the savanna and just chomping up entire plants, potentially roots and all. That's kind of at the extreme end of herbivory. Many herbivores are actually fairly specialized in what they will consume, both in terms of the species that they will consume and the plant parts that they actually feed on. And so there's a number of types of herbivores that feed on specialized structures. So frugivores focus their efforts on fruit. Granivores, seeds and nuts. Nectivores feed on the nectar in flowers. Foliivores consume the leaves. Root herbivores doesn't seem to have some special name, but obviously, as the name suggests, they feed on the roots of plants. Xylophages feed on wood, so the xylem, the lignified tissue, and this will predominantly be insects, wood-boring insects, but there are some others as well. And then detritivores, which we've already talked about, which consume the decaying plant material. Okay, and not only are many herbivores specialized on the part of the plant that they will feed on, but there are lots of species that are also pretty specialized to particular plant species. So they have a preferred plant species and they won't feed on other things, or their preference is pretty narrow, is limited to a pretty narrow range of species. And this is reflected here in this graph, where on the x-axis we have the number of plant species eaten. On the y-axis we have the number of agromazid species, so a type of flies. And you can see here that the vast majority of these fly species feed on one or only a handful of plant species. There are very, very few species that are kind of more generalist and will feed on 10, 15, 20 different species. So this is very common, and a lot of this is reflected by the fact that the vast majority of herbivores are insects. Most of the herbivore diversity is captured in the insect group, and many insects are fairly specialized. They'll use only a small number of plant species typically. Okay. So when we're thinking about predation, and specifically here I'm talking about carnivory, there are different ways that predators can capture their prey. And one of these is through pursuit predation. And this is, predators actually chasing their prey. So when you have carnivores and they're feeding on animals, those animals can get away from that carnivore, and it's in their best interest to do so. So there's a couple of strategies for dealing with that mobility of your prey species. One of them is chasing or pursuing your prey species, okay? And so those predators actively pursue their prey, and this requires a couple of key things: speed and endurance, the ability to actually move faster than your prey species and or travel fairly quickly over long distances, okay? Have that high level of endurance. And here are just 3 examples of species that use this approach. Cheetahs, of course, one of the fastest organisms in the world. Here's a pod of dolphins. So a lot of pursuit predators will hunt in packs. and work together. So this sort of cooperative behavior to hunt down their prey. Dolphins are a great example of that. And then here we have an insect that's a pursuit predator, dragonflies, and we really value dragonflies for their ability to consume biting insects and different insects that we don't favor. They are of course predating those insects, and they have to chase them down to consume them. Okay, the second main strategy for predation for carnivory is the ambush predation approach, or kind of the sit and wait approach. And there's all kinds of different ways that adaptations that animals have evolved to ambush their prey. And many of these are really quite beautiful and surprising and really remarkable. So in many cases, in almost all cases, these animals will use camouflage and concealment to allow them to sit and wait until prey comes along, and then just at the right moment they jump out and grab their prey, okay? And there's a few examples here, and in this picture we have a female goldenrod crab spider, and so you can see that she blends in incredibly well with the background of this particular flower. And so this mating pair of flies came in, is on this flower, and this female crab spider, goldenrod crab spider, has captured the female fly in this pair. Okay, so being able to blend in with your background and sit patiently until your prey species arrives and comes right to you is a great way of dealing with predation. Here's another great example. This is the frogfish. And it looks very much like the coral that it swims amongst. And you can see, let's see, it's even hard to see a little bit, but I believe here are the eyes up here, and there's the mouth. These may be the eyes actually, but there's the mouth. And so it just sits there and blends in with its background. And then when the prey comes close, it opens its mouth, and that change of pressure basically pulls the prey into its mouth. This orchid mantis is another beautiful example. You can see the legs, you can see the orchid that it's perched upon, and the mantis itself really looks very much like kind of an extension of that orchid, and again just sits there waiting for some insect to come along, potentially a pollinator to come along to the orchid, at which point the mantis will grab it with its front legs. And finally, in our last picture, we have a trapdoor spider, and you can see this down in its burrow, and those trapdoor spiders actually pull a little trapdoor across the top, and they can feel when prey are coming along, and then just at the right moment they open that trapdoor and pull the prey right down into the trap. You should Google that. You should Google trapdoor spiders and watch some videos, because they're really surprising and amazing. Or look at any number of YouTube videos of ambush predators, because they're really pretty fascinating, their behavior. Okay, so, but prey are not helpless. We have all kinds of anti-predator adaptations that prey have evolved to be able to deal with being hunted. And this is just one example. These are wildebeest on, in the savannah, and you can see all of these organisms, and they all look almost exactly the same, and they're all clustered together and, kind of moving around, and it's a very confusing situation. And this, in fact, is referred to as the confusion effect. If a predator can't actually identify an individual that it's targeting, that it's hunting, it gets confused, and its efficacy will really decrease. And so a lot of herbivores will, where you have herds of herbivores, they'll take this approach, this confusion. They'll use this confusion advantage. So in this case, a larger group size equals a reduced chance of predation success. But there's all kinds of other ways that that organisms can avoid being predated. In some cases, like in the case of this pangolin, a very hard armor will be produced that makes it very hard for that organism to be consumed. So pangolins will actually roll up into a ball with this hard plated armor on the outside, allowing them to protect themselves from predators who are interested in eating them. In other cases, various types of coloration is used. And so here we have a beautiful moth that's camouflaged into the leaves on this forest floor. So if you're able to hide, you can avoid in many cases being predated. And if you recall, we remember the example of that directional selection of the spotted moths in the UK that changed color in response to pollution with the Industrial Revolution, because it helped them camouflage themselves against the sooty walls and avoid being consumed by predators. So same kind of idea. And evolution pushes coloration to allow species to be able to blend into their backgrounds. But in other cases, organisms are really trying actively to be apparent. And in some cases, this is, a real warning signal where the coloration reflects the fact that the prey species is toxic, and it's a warning to the predators: don't eat me because I'm going to make you sick. In other cases, it's what we refer to as mimicry. And this is being able to resemble less palatable organisms so predators avoid them. All right, and this is kind of false advertising, and it only really works when you have more of the poisonous, the actual warning or coloration or aposematic coloration than you do the mimic. If you have too many mimics in the crowd, then all of a sudden the predator is going to catch on and realize, well, most of the time this doesn't make me sick. So then the coloration doesn't work so well. So crypsis is what we talked about here, this camouflage. And then there can be behavioral changes. And we talked about that with the wildebeests. But here's another example with muskox, where when there's a predator around, muskox will form a tight circle with their heads and horns facing out, and they cluster together. And this group behavior really helps to protect them from predation. Okay, so that was carnivores and how carnivores deal with prey and how prey deal with carnivores. But then there's also this component of herbivores. How do plants deal with predation? How do plants deal with herbivory? There's a number of strategies. One is simply avoidance, okay? And there's a number of ways that plants can do this. One is, if we think of granivores, so those herbivores that consume seeds and nuts, and or frugivores, which consume the fruits. One way to avoid predation is to produce so many seeds or fruits that you absolutely overwhelm the predator. And so this allows most of your offspring, most of those seeds or fruits, to escape predation. And so a great example of this, we have this beautiful masting oak here, and you can see the whole, this is in a park, but the entire ground surface is covered in acorns. And so of course, there will be a lot of acorns consumed, but if you produce enough seeds, then quite a large number of those acorns will also escape predation, okay? So this is what masting, this is the sort of evolutionary significance of masting. And then you can also have tissue production when herbivores are scarce. So maybe there's seasonality in the climate and you produce your foliage or your new roots or whatever it happens to be, timed in such a way that you avoid your the herbivore the sort of peak densities of that herbivore. Or production of tissues that look inedible. So very often plants, when they're producing new leaves, will produce them in a color that's not, they will produce, very often red or sometimes white leaves. They will not invest in chloroplasts, which are very nitrogen rich and which are necessary for photosynthesis. They won't invest in those chloroplasts in the leaves early on because A, it reduces the attractiveness of those leaves to herbivores. So if they're not green, if they're not nutritious, herbivores aren't going to prefer those. And B, if they do get consumed, then the cost is less to the plant, okay? And here's a great example of this new foliage in this particular species. I can't recall what species this is, but this new foliage actually looks like dead leaves. But it's just the new foliage that's been produced, and eventually when those have toughened up enough, when the plant has invested enough lignin into that leaf tissue to protect the leaf, or invested the chemical defenses into that leaf to protect the leaf, then it will invest in the chlorophyll and the chloroplasts and green those leaves up, and they'll become photosynthetic. And in that way, the plant is able to avoid being consumed. And mimicry, camouflage, all of these things are not restricted to the animal kingdom. Plants do it too, which is pretty cool. And this is a really amazing paper, this paper that's cited at the bottom. If you go to that paper, I'll actually pop it up on my learning space. It just has beautiful pictures of all kinds of amazing adaptations of plants to herbivory, and their different ways of avoiding herbivory. But they use very similar kinds of tools or similar kinds of approaches as animals do to avoid carnivory. And so examples of this are these bright red flowers in this papaver species that warn herbivores that the tissue is toxic. Another example is mimicry. So in this particular Aminium species, this coloration, when you're far enough away from the flower, this coloration actually looks like ants on the surface of the plant. And so obviously this species is living in a place where there are what we refer to as myrmecophytic species, or plants that rely on ants for protection. And so if you have coloration on some part of your plant body that mimics the look of ants, makes it look like you have ants on your tissues, then many herbivores will avoid that, because ants will attack herbivores that are trying to consume your tissue. And so if your herbivore thinks you have ants on the surface, they may be more likely to avoid you. And finally, here's a really cool example of camouflage, where the trichomes on this particular plant species in this desert environment actually collect sand, and so help that plant blend into the background. Now, of course, all of these different things come at a cost. Pigmentation, having this additional layer of sediment on top of your photosynthetic surface, all of these things are costly. And so the evolutionary balance is, having defense mechanisms that mean that that improve your carbon balance more than the herbivory reduces your carbon balance. So kind of puts you into a good place from a carbon balance perspective. So these are different ways that plants avoid herbivory. But some plants also just tolerate herbivory. And here's an example from your text. This is field gentians, and this particular situation was an experiment, a herbivory experiment, okay? But what this is showing us is this idea of compensation, which when we think about herbivory, this is really tolerance of herbivory. If you're able to have some portion of your biomass eaten and still then regrow that, and maybe even in some cases do a little bit better, then you're able to tolerate that herbivory to some extent. There's no plant that can tolerate extreme rates of herbivory, but to a certain level, some plants are able to deal with herbivory and actually in some cases thrive. So what compensation means is that the removal of plant tissue stimulates a plant to produce new tissues, allowing for relatively rapid replacement of the material eaten by herbivores. And we see this here in this situation. So we have our plants that were before clipping, and then we have two treatments, a clipped treatment, an unclipped treatment, and a clipped treatment. And clipping happened on different dates, okay? And so what we see is that plants that were clipped on July 12th or on July 20th actually produced more fruit than the control. The control is the unclipped individuals. If clipping happened too late in the season, then that plant was not able to compensate for the loss of biomass and produced fewer fruits than the control. But we see that in response to this clipping early in the season, there was actually an increase in this case, fruit production. In some cases, it will be biomass production. Okay, so this is compensation or tolerance of herbivory. And finally, we have defenses. And this is a really fascinating field. There are any number of structural and chemical defenses that plants use to help them fend off herbivores. You know, in the simplest case, we have spines that make that plant harder to consume. You can think of cacti. You can think of any number of kind of pokey species that are not nice to touch, and that you can imagine if you were trying to actually put your mouth around that and consume those tissues, that it would be very uncomfortable. And so lots of plants have physical defenses. These may be trichomes, they may be spines, and in some cases it's just really tough, unpalatable tissues that are the sort of physical defense. In other cases, there are actual chemical defenses that are produced, and these can be induced or they can be constitutive. So constitutive defenses are defenses that, you know, as soon as the plant makes tissue, it invests in these defenses, okay? So if you think about, you know, for example, when you put a fresh Christmas tree in your house and you smell that lovely fir smell, those are actually chemical defenses in the tree, terpenes, that are produced by many conifers in the Pinaceae, and are, you know, unpalatable constitutive defense components. There are lots of species that their tissue has some background level of chemical defense kind of all the time. There are other species that may have those constitutive defenses, but may also respond by inducing the production of defenses in response to an attack. So you have a caterpillar come along and munch on your leaves, and that leads to signals within the plant to upregulate, for genes to upregulate the production of toxins to reduce herbivory. So that can be a direct defense. But what herbivory can also do is all of these amazing indirect defenses, okay? So this can be the production. So you have an insect come along and munches on your leaves, and you produce, in response to that, some volatile emission. That signals other insects to come and visit you. It basically is telling them, hey, you know, I've got interesting insects here for you to eat. And so it will attract predators of those herbivores to the plant. In other cases, perhaps it attracts parasitoids, right? So there are these volatile emissions that can lead to the attraction of predators and parasitoids of the herbivores that are actually on your tissue. Pretty amazing. Another indirect line of defense is extrafloral nectaries, and these are typically constitutive. You have these, you know, there will be extrafloral nectaries all the time. They're not produced in response to herbivory. And these extrafloral nectaries are basically rewards for animals that protect you. And so we already talked about these myrmecophytic species, these ant plants that produce ample amounts of extrafloral nectaries that feed ants, and the ants in turn protect the plant from herbivores or from structural parasites. So vines climbing up, they'll actually clip them. They provide all kinds of protection for those plants. In other cases, in acacias, the acacia actually produces a structure, a spiny structure that provides the home for the ants. And so in that case, that's the reward for the ant, to protect that acacia from various herbivores. Okay, so there's rewards that a plant can give for its bodyguards. There's signals that a plant can send out to tell predators and parasitoids, come on over, I've got a buffet for you. And there's upregulation of defenses in direct response to herbivory that can then deter those herbivores. So there's just an amazing wealth of ways that plants can defend themselves against herbivory. But just as we saw with prey species of carnivores, there's the counterattack. Insects are actually, you know, as plants evolve defenses, herbivores evolve ways to get around those defenses, okay? So herbivores can overcome plant defenses through structural, chemical, and behavioral adaptation. Okay, so we have two examples here of this. One is monarchs, and we have this beautiful monarch larva on a milkweed plant. Monarchs are completely specialized to milkweeds, the larvae are. That is what they consume as they're developing. But the milkweeds contain a milky latex that contains cardenolides, which have a really negative impact on the health of organisms that eat it. They can induce vomiting, they can cause problems with heart function for animals that consume these. But a lot of this stems back to the impact of these cardenolides on sodium pump, which all animals have. Interestingly, the way monarchs have gotten around this is there have been sequential mutations that have been adopted in this species. One mutation which caused a change in one of the proteins that functions in the sodium pump, which allowed it to be more tolerant of this toxin, and the second, which kind of mitigated some neural issues associated with that change to the sodium pump. So, you know, these amazing mutations that happen, and they had to happen in the right sequence in order for monarchs to evolve to be able to consume and tolerate this toxin in the milkweed tissue. So all of this, you know, really strong evolutionary selective pressure on organisms as they're to overcome different defenses. Another example here is this different species in the Burseraceae, these Bursera species. They contain resin, toxic resin, that's held under very high pressure in resin ducts. So if you slice open that resin duct, you can see that resin squirting out, and it's toxic, and it also comes out at a very high, it's been under pressure, so it comes out at a very fast rate and can either injure or kill the insect if it gets hit by this spray of resin. These little blepharids are able to, so again, a larval stage is able to, it has evolved a behavioral adaptation to deal with this defense mechanism. What it does is it consumes the leaf, but it bites through into these resin ducts very slowly and in little tiny bites, so that the resin is released at a slower rate, and the pressure in those resin ducts is decreased, and so then the insect is able to continue consuming the leaf without the risk of being sprayed at high pressures by resin. Okay, so just a couple of examples of really amazing kind of counterattacks that have been driven by chemical and behavioral adaptations. But the idea that I want to get across here for both carnivores and herbivores is the idea of evolutionary arms race. And so when we talk about this, it's a struggle between competing sets of co-evolving genes, traits, or species that develop adaptations and counter adaptations against each other, resembling an arms race. So it's this positive feedback. You know, the plant evolves some defense, the herbivore then responds and evolves some counter defense. And so it goes. And so we have this evolutionary arms race, so to speak. And this is a really interesting part of these predator-prey dynamics, is always kind of trying to one-up the other species. Okay, so we're just about through here, but just some examples of how predation, these different types of predation, can impact population dynamics. So of course we know that predators impact prey and vice versa. We've seen these examples of predation cycles or predator-prey cycles. And here we have an example of an invasive weed, Klamath weed, which became a really kind of noxious pest in the U.S. It ended up covering about 4 million hectares of rangeland, and the reason it was such a problem is that when cows would eat it, it would poison them. So of course, Klamath weed had some kind of defense compound in it that poisoned the cows. So what ranchers did was release beetles into, Chrysalina beetles into these areas that were impacted by Klamath weed. The Chrysalina beetle was able to very quickly reduce the densities. Here's the plant cover from 0 to 40%. At its peak here in 1952, it was up at around 50%. And once those beetles were introduced in the late 40s, very quickly the Klamath weed population crashed and disappeared. And we can see the response of the Chrysalina beetles, where they were introduced at low densities. Their densities increased because there was a huge amount of prey available. These herbivores responded to the prey availability. But then as that prey population crashed, very quickly after, the Chrysalina beetle population crashed as well. So this is very typical, and this is kind of an ideal situation of biologic control. A lot of times we don't see this kind of perfect situation, and in fact you have introduction of a species, maybe it causes the initial target to crash, but then that species is able to find some other host and can really cause snowballing problems in the new range into which it's introduced. So this is kind of a very ideal example of how biologic control works, and a lot of times it's a lot more complicated than that. Carnivory can, of course, have a huge impact on community structure. And so this is a really cool example where these researchers worked in these little tiny islands in the Bahamas, pretty tough life, and they introduced, anole lizards, if anyone's been down into, in the Caribbean, these little anole lizards are everywhere on mainland places, but on some of these little islands they were absent. And so these researchers experimentally introduced anole lizards, a small density of anole lizards, to islands, and they had nests of islands where one of the islands would have a naturally occurring population of the lizard, one of the islands would have no lizard, or a couple of the islands would have no lizards present, and on one of those islands they would introduce a small population of lizards. And what you can see is that where lizards were absent, their response variable that they measured was spider species composition. So these anole lizards feed on spiders and other insects, and these researchers were interested in the impact of these anole lizards on spiders. And so you can see where lizards are absent from these islands, we see very low rates of extinction, only about 5%. And remember, these are very small islands, so extinction, it's a local extinction, and we're talking about a very small area, so again, a small population, higher chance of extinction. So we see about a 5% chance of extinction where lizards are absent. Where lizards are introduced or where lizards are present naturally, this is much, much higher. So you can see the impact on the whole spider community in this case of having predators within the population. So this is just an example of how carnivory can impact the whole community. And we can look at the same thing for impacts of herbivory on communities and on ecosystems. And so in this case, we're looking at a community. These are Arctic salt marshes on the Hudson Bay lowlands area. And this is work that started a very long time ago by Bob Jeffries, who was a professor at the University of Toronto. And he was monitoring, he was studying the dynamics of, the feeding behavior of snow geese and their impact on the plant communities. And initially what they found was that the presence of snow geese in these Arctic environments was really positive, because the snow geese would come and they would feed on the plants. So even though they were feeding on the salt marsh species, so predominantly sedges and grasses, they were also defecating very regularly, and that feces increase the nutrient concentration of the soil, and the Arctic is a low nutrient environment. It's very nutrient deficient. So low levels of grazing actually increased above ground net primary productivity, so the amount of biomass being produced above ground in these salt marsh environments. Now, these snow geese are migratory. They spend their summers, their breeding season in the Arctic on these salt marshes. They spend their winters further south in the US. And so this was all well and good. The geese were having a positive impact on biomass, but then around the 1970s, they started to notice that the populations of snow geese were increasing exponentially, and this was having a really negative impact on salt marsh plant communities. And you can see this exemplified here, where they put in, again, we talked about these herbivore exclosures before, but they put in a herbivore exclosure, and they show that where geese are excluded from the landscape, that the salt marsh community remains intact, where this higher density of geese was able to feed on the landscape. It no longer had this positive impact, but instead converted these salt marsh environments to mudflats. And so the issue was that as agricultural land expanded in the overwintering habitat, there was plenty of food available for the snow geese, and so their winter survival was much higher. Then they would return in larger numbers to these salt marshes, and the higher numbers increased the herbivory pressure, leading to a huge amount of damage to these ecosystems. And here we have a second example of the golden apple snail, which was introduced to Taiwan and has spread throughout many parts of Asia, Southeast Asia and Asia, because it's able to float around, disperse by floating around on vegetation. So it feeds on aquatic vegetation in wetlands. So you find the snail in wetlands. It was introduced in Taiwan and has spread throughout the region, but you find it in wetlands, and it consumes plant cover. And so so researchers set out to try to understand the impacts on the ecosystem of this particular snail, and they found that where the snail was in low densities, and so again, they used quadrats. We learned about quadrat sampling. They used quadrats because snails are pretty slow moving, and they wanted to quantify the impact on vegetation. They used quadrat sampling. They looked at the plant cover, the percent cover of plants, and when snails, and the density of snails within those quadrats. And when snail densities were low, plant cover was high. Between 50 and 100% of their quadrats were covered in plants, in aquatic plants. As snail density increased, all of a sudden that plant cover crashed to 0%. So they removed all plant material. And in conjunction with that, we see an increase in phosphorus concentrations in the waters of the wetlands, and in chlorophyll A concentrations, which are a good indication of algal abundance in the water. And so you can see that our plant population crashes, so we are reduced from 100% to down to 0% at fairly low snail densities. Well, I don't know, 10 snails per meter squared is actually quite a lot. And the opposite happens. So we see an increase in phosphorus concentration. So those snails are consuming the plants, and then again, their feces is being, their excrement is being released into the water, increasing the nutrient availability in the water, which very often corresponds with increases in algal productivity, because then the algae have resources in that water. And so we see this increase in chlorophyll A concentration. So this one species in wetlands throughout this region has led to a shift in the ecosystem from these productive wetlands where there's lots of plants and very clear water, to systems where there is very little plant cover, the water is fairly turbid, high nutrient concentrations, and really susceptible to algal blooms. And so we can see the impacts of these, in this case, herbivory dynamics at the ecosystem level. Okay, and finally, I don't want you to go through this and understand every arrow in detail, but I just wanted to highlight really the complexity of some of these dynamics that we've talked about. So, predation, like all of these different parts of the system are linked because of these trophic dynamics. So you have plants interacting with plants through, competition, which we'll learn about in our next lecture, herbivores feeding on plants, and then various types of omnivores or carnivores feeding on those lower trophic levels. And climate change can impact all of these different interactions. And then you can even get down to the sort of the rhizosphere, where we have dynamics of plant roots with different detritivores and root herbivores, as well as their root symbionts. There are lots of ways, and in a lot of cases, we're not sure the direction that many of these interactions will go in the face of climate warming. But this diagram is taken from a paper where they tried to sort of capture the extent of the responses that we see. And we can see in many cases, responses can be either positive or negative. And so it makes prediction of how, and because of the interconnection of all of these different components of an ecosystem, it makes the prediction of how these trophic dynamics are going to change in response to climate warming and associated disturbances. Makes it very, very hard to predict. So that is all I have to say today about predation. Again, please don't forget we have our next speaker in the Meet the Scientist series coming to us on Thursday at 5:30, a synchronous lecture in our class time. You have the Zoom link. And we will continue our discussion of these biotic interactions next week with, and we'll go through a competition. Okay, and with that, have a great evening. I'll see you during student hours potentially. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Take care.